Britain banned the slave trade in 1807 to, in quotes, save African lives. But here is a twisted truth. This decision triggered 50 years of civil war in Yorubaland that actually increased slavery and gave Britain the perfect excuse to colonize Nigeria. 1 million people were still enslaved and exported after the ban. How did Britain's supposed humanitarian gesture become ancient Nigeria's bloodiest nightmare? Let's rewind to 1807. The British Parliament just banned the slave trade. They were patting themselves on the back for this moral victory, but there's a problem they didn't consider. For over a century, the mighty Oyo Empire had been the superpower of Yorubaland. They controlled the slave routes, commanded massive armies, and their economy was built on one thing: selling captives to European traders. Britain and France were their biggest customers, buying the majority of slaves shipped from Oyo's ports. Now imagine you're running a business and suddenly your two biggest customers disappear overnight. That's what actually happened to Oyo. The French were knocked out by their revolution and the Napoleonic Wars. The British voluntarily walked away from the trade they once dominated. The commercial uncertainty didn't just hurt Oyo's economy, it destroyed the political foundations that held the empire together. Without the wealth from slave trading, Oyo couldn't pay its armies, maintain its roads, or keep its vassal states loyal. By 1817, the Great Oyo Empire, once the terror of West Africa, collapsed into civil war. And that's when the real nightmare began. You see, just as Oyo was falling apart in 1817, the international slave market boomed again. Cuba and Brazil were desperate for slaves, and slave prices skyrocketed. But instead of Oyo selling slaves from other regions, Oyo itself became the source. The Yoruba nation got trapped in a deadly cycle. They needed guns to fight their wars, but guns cost money. How do you get money in that era? By raiding for slaves. But slave raiding created more enemies, which means you need more guns, which means more slave raids. Military leaders weren't stupid. They knew exactly what they were doing. Wars and slaves had become complementary business. The more chaos, the more profits. Out of this chaos rose new powers that started as literal war camps. The most successful was Ibadan, a city that began as a military base for refugees fleeing the Oyo Civil Wars. Ibadan's war boys, the Omo Ogun, became the most feared raiders in West Africa. They fought off the advancing Fulani from the north, seized control of trade routes to Lagos ports, and turned their war camps into the largest black city in Africa during the 19th century. But Ibadan's success terrified everyone else. The Egba people founded Abeokuta specifically to counter Ibadan's power. From the west, the kingdom of Dahomey saw opportunity and launched their own trade deep into Yorubaland, switching sides based on whoever offered the best alliance. By the 1830s, all of Yorubaland was a battlefield. Everyone was fighting everyone. Meanwhile, Britain was playing a dangerous double game. They established a naval blockade with up to 1/6 of their entire navy patrolling the West African coast. They set up a base in Fernando Po, right off the Nigerian coast, to catch slave ships. But here is where everything becomes wicked. The blockade made slavery more profitable, not less. The risk of getting caught meant higher prices for successful deliveries. Despite all their humanitarian efforts, almost 1 million people were still exported as slaves from ancient Nigeria in the 19th century. The British got increasingly frustrated that their blockade wasn't working. The Yoruba wars were feeding a constant stream of captives to Lagos ports, and local rulers weren't cooperating with British anti-slavery treaties. So in 1861, Britain did what it did best when diplomacy failed. They annexed Lagos by force, claiming they needed to stop the slave trade and bring peace to the region. This is where Britain's genius and cruelty becomes clear. They had created the perfect justification for colonization. Every time there was fighting, they could say, "We need to intervene to protect commerce and stop slavery." From Lagos, they gradually extended control along the entire coast. Each protective treaty led to more annexation. Each intervention required deeper involvement in local politics. The method was always the same: dictate treaties that local rulers couldn't possibly fulfill, then use their failure to justify taking over completely. By the 1870s and 1880s, pressure from missionaries and liberated slaves returning from Sierra Leone gave Britain even more excuses to expand their control. So here is the bitter truth. While the Sokoto Caliphate in the north had brought peace, unity, and prosperity to their region, the south was trapped in 50 years of civil war triggered by Britain's slave trade ban. The British couldn't easily conquer the organized, unified Sokoto Caliphate, but a fragmented war-torn Yorubaland that was easy picking. Each Yoruba city-state could be picked off one by one. But what happened when those two worlds finally collided? When Britain decided they wanted to control not just the chaotic south, but the powerful, unified north as well, what did it take to bring down the mighty Sokoto Caliphate that had resisted European influence for almost a century? Drop a comment if you want the next episode about how Britain finally conquered the mighty Sokoto Caliphate using the deadliest weapon in colonial history. Not just guns or cannons, but something more devastating that turned Africans against each other. Follow, because this story explains why Nigeria became one country and why North and South divide still shapes our history today.